Hey,
All right,
I
we're
think
good.
holy shit, that's loud. Hey,
What's up, D? How you doing, man?
hey, I'm great, man. Thanks for joining.
Dude, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
Yes, yeah, me too, very much. Seems there are a lot of other people looking forward to it as well. We've already got 35 people, so
That's a lot. That's big time.
is it? I don't know. I've never done anything
I,
like
I
this,
think
so
it is, yeah. Well, you have
cool.
like a million followers, so that helps,
At
you
least
know?
a million, I think. Yeah, at this point.
You're on your way there.
I'm not, and I'm not trying. So thank you
And that
though.
and that's why you'll get there.
Yeah, maybe, but yeah, so cool, man. It's and we haven't really actually had too many interactions to
Oh,
date, but I just after watching your discussion with John, I was convinced that we should do this, um, and despite not really knowing a whole lot about you or other than what I've seen on your feed. So, but really, the main reason for wanting to do this discussion was because I come from mostly, or developed, I should say, I developed my following here on Instagram very much based on my yoga background. So, I think having a discussion with you would be really informative for my followers and people I'm connected with here on this platform because we do things that are or you do things that are so very much outside of the yoga paradigm, but could very much apply to them if understood properly. So, yeah, I just thought it would be an informative discussion given our distinct backgrounds and probably that we align in many important ways. Um, Given my recent transition into general movement practice, so
mhm.
uh, yeah, but I
Yeah.
think but I think it's pretty much steadied out here in terms of how many people are joining. It's still around 40. It's 43 now. Yeah, it's fluctuating on and off. So we can probably just get started if you're ready.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, we have different backgrounds in training, but like you said, we all have human bodies and we're all moving. So I think the principles kind of line up, um, and maybe we'll see eye to eye on a lot of things. Maybe not, and that's okay.
Yeah, hopefully not everything because that would be really boring, right? uh, yeah. So what I had in mind was in like it's not like I'm hosting or you're hosting, but more just sort of an open-ended discussion because. Uh, I think, given that it's my first time on here too, probably people want to hear a little bit about me and my practice, and just as much as they want to hear about yours, so we can just sort of keep it balanced in that way, hopefully. I don't have too much experience
Yeah,
with
we're
this
just
kind of
having a
thing,
chat.
so sweet. Um, so I guess we can start by, I want to start by hearing a little bit about how you would describe in your own words what you do, and if you've gotten this, if you've gone through this spiel before and some of the people listening might have heard this, you might spin it in a different way or give them something that you haven't shared before about your how you started your journey or why you do it.
Yeah, I mean that's actually a tough question. What do I do? Um,
Yeah.
because as like a personal trainer, what I consider myself, it really depends on the individual, what they want to do, what their goals are, what they're capable of. Yeah, so I train people who do CrossFit. I train people, marathon runners, and a lot of times what they want to do is continue doing something outside our practice, which is what they love. And it's my job to help them continue doing what they love, do it pain-free, injury-free as much as possible. Um, add some longevity, add some performance to it. So I try to do some just fundamental stuff that helps whatever their movement practice is.
Mm.
And then I come to people who it I'm sure you see this a lot. They're looking for a movement practice, so they come to you. And then really it's just almost random stuff, you know.
Mm.
Try to do basics, whatever that is. And that's where it gets into, I don't know. But yeah, for most people, it's just I try to dig into what they enjoy doing and help them with that. That's about it.
Sure. So do you get any people that come to you and they're like, I just want to do what you do? You know, I saw you online, or I saw you on on Instagram or Facebook or wherever they saw you, and they're like, I want to move like you, or I want to get stronger, or that's their primary focus. Do you get that?
Yeah, I get that a lot, and those are the people who are usually most disappointed. Because
Why do you think that is?
well, the majority of what I do isn't the stuff I put out on post on Instagram, really. That's just me playing around. I guess that's kind of the fruits of whatever I built in my training. Because if I just put up my doing isometrics and all the the kind of boring, unsexy stuff, that's what I give people when they come to me like, I want to do what you do. I'm like, okay, let's do all this, prepare your body, get your joints working, and then I'll add in, now do whatever you want. Because that's what I'm doing on Instagram. I'm not doing a certain program. I'm just playing with shit. So, yeah, it's chaotic. So it's hard to just have people, all right, go outside and lift random objects off the street. It's really
That's not a good idea.
Shoulder, and do you have overhead stability? Do you have all these things where you can go into a chaotic environment and play? And I don't think playing is the goal we need, but it's not the practice we need in order to get there, if that makes sense.
It's not the goal we need, but it
is the goal we need.
It is the goal we need, but it's
I think
not the practice we need. Okay, yeah, now I
is a
follow.
big goal. So, I talk about this with football players. People are like, I want to look like Ray Lewis or some NFL athlete. I'm like, you know what? You look up to them because how they are on the field. But if you put a helmet on and just pick up football every day, you're not going to look like them, right? There's fundamental things they did to get there, aside from genetics. So what I'm putting on Instagram and I don't know if you feel the same way, I'm putting the game, the football game up there, but not the hours in the weight room, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's probably one thing that our accounts have in common, in the way that we reach people is, our face, our social media face doesn't really accurately represent what we do from day to day. In my case, that's maybe even more so because so much of my practice is non-physical. And I come from a philosophical background and a practice of, you could call it mindfulness. I don't really like that word, but yeah, something like that. And that's even harder to represent, especially because most of the work I'm doing can't be represented physically, but also because the physical work that I'm doing is difficult and, like you say, maybe a little bit unsexy to represent in videos for people. So, or photos. So most of what you see on my account to date is like, it is and it isn't the same as what you described, because it's like I'm not doing the stuff that looks sexy just for its own sake. There is a specific purpose to why I post what I post, but other than just showing fruits of my practice, because I do show a little bit of the process and a little bit of the steps on the way. But that's one thing I noticed about your account that was striking, was that you seem to have an ability to represent the fact that there's a deeper process there and that there's a lot that goes into what you do without actually posting any of the steps. And I'm curious to know, do you have a specific reason, or like do you have clear reasoning behind why you don't post your process, other than that it's unsexy and not attractive? Like do you know where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I can give you a reason. And I loved what you said about mindfulness, because that's the hardest thing to relay on this platform is intensity. And it's part of what we're doing at the moment is the why we're doing. Yeah, and that's huge, and that's, I guess, why we write a paragraph and try to hammer that in, the why behind. But yeah, as far as why I don't put the steps in, you know, I put it, some steps I put in, but I just kind of put, I mean, how it started for me is I put out what I thought was cool. Like, this is going to be a cool video, right?
Sure.
This would be the film.
Yeah, I relate to that.
Really what I do, you know? I don't have a better answer to that. The steps come. I feel like that brings people in. That cake, the cookies we put out bring people in. They want to know how to get there, and then that's when I give them the vegetables to eat. Because if I just gave people vegetables, and I don't want to become one of those people, those form Nazis who are like, you have to make sure you have this shoulder range and active, functional body. Like, this is what I like to do. This is me playing. If you are interested in the steps I took to prepare myself, then you could approach me and we could have that conversation. But I start with the shit I think is cool. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I want to actually, that was one thing that I saw you speak about with John Yuen when you did your talk with him that sort of sparked my interest and got my wheels turning. I wanted to ask you about that, because you talked about you used to be very focused on technique a lot, and you were sort of like the technique guy who was always do it this way and very focused on that in terms of your coaching. But I think before we get into that question quick, I should probably say a little bit about myself and my practice, so people are like, okay, who is this guy? What is he doing?
We need to know who you are.
Yeah, okay. So my name's Devin, Devin Kelly, and I come from the East Coast of the United States, about 50 minutes north of Boston, and in southern New Hampshire. That's where I grew up. I spent about 7+ years in North Carolina, where I went to college there. I studied philosophy and world religions. And so I guess you could say if you put those things together, it's more like, the study of global values. And I don't know how else to put it. And then, so I guess what I do is I'm a teacher in various capacities. And a large part of my focus for teaching, like I say, is non-physical practice. So I teach narrative, what I call narrative excavation process and narrative therapy, not like the 1970s psychotherapy method, narrative therapy. It's more of a mindfulness or awareness practice based system. So that's a big part of what I do, and I do that online. I do that in person. I've been doing that in person for quite a while, thousands of hours of doing that in person with people in groups, with people one-on-one. And then also a big part of what I do is movement practice, movement coaching. I used to be quite focused on yoga, and that was sort of where I began my movement journey. It was my first experience with any sort of qualitative movement discipline. Because before that, I was a competitive athlete in track, so I was running the 800 meters. I was focused on that for the better part of 8 or 9 years, and so yoga was sort of like my first taste of a qualitative movement practice that was focused on how we're doing things, and not so much the competitive result. So that's where I got my start in movement practice, and that was my focus for some time. But pretty recently, in the past 2 or 3 years or so, I've transitioned really heavy and hard away from that specialization and toward, I guess, what you would call general progressive movement practice. So that's what I teach now, and I've sort of expanded myself out into that cloud that's hard to define in many ways. So yeah, I guess what I would say is I'm a teacher in various capacities. I think that's probably the best way to put it. Yeah.
So I have a question for you. What is your, do you have a spiritual outlook or practice personally?
Yeah, that's a good question. Spiritual is a funny word, I guess, and it's a little bit hard to nail down, but and it means different things to different people. But um, in terms of my own vocabulary and value system, I'm not sure I would use spiritual, but I've studied many value systems over the course of my career, and some of them have taken root in my heart. So I guess in my life to life, day to day practice in my life. So I guess in a sense you could say that these value systems and these philosophies or approaches to understanding yourself and understanding the world have become a spiritual practice for me. But I wouldn't say that I believe any dogmatically, and I wouldn't say that yeah. So that's what I would say about that. Like, for example, during my studies in university, I studied classical Chinese philosophy, and with a heavy focus on Taoism. So a lot of those philosophies, like, when I read the Zhuangzi, I read it very much like a spiritual text. And it informs my life and the way that I see people and the way that I interact and form relationships and understand how I flow through the world. And the same might be true of some Buddhist precepts, and the same might be true of some yogic precepts. But I wouldn't really say that I prescribe to any one particular spirituality or dogma or discipline. It's more that I use these to inform my life day to day. Yeah, maybe that's the best way to say it.
Okay. So
But
you lean
how about
towards
you?
the Eastern concepts of, I guess, philosophically.
I guess naturally, yeah. I would say that happened. I'm not. I can't say that I made a conscious choice about that. But when I read them and when I studied them, those are the ones that I guess just took root in my heart, as I said. Because I did during my university education. My university, Queen's University of Charlotte, was a Presbyterian affiliate school, so there was also a heavy focus on Christianity. So I studied that heavily, and I went in depth. Like, I remember taking this one almost graduate level course on letters of Paul, and I just got so involved in it, and I was very, very passionate about learning it. But it never really took root the same way, Yeah, just can't really give a clear explanation for that or like a conscious reasoning, but some things just resonate and some don't, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
And so before we jump into that question that I had before for you about technique, I'm curious to know for yourself too. Do you have a mindfulness practice, meditation practice, spiritual practice? What would you consider your non-physical practice, if any?
Yeah, honestly, I don't separate the two at
Right.
all. Even when I do, so I guess you can call it, I don't think of it as meditation, maybe because the word, we get that just association with it. But I have a breathing practice where I'll just be mindful of my breath. I guess a mindfulness practice. And that I'm really just working on breathing and diaphragm control, and just, it's very physical for me. I used to do just the mindfulness of watching my thoughts, and that was, I feel like adding in the physical part of really concentrating on the breath made all the difference. So I tie that in. Yeah, that's probably the only mindfulness practice I do aside from movement. Anytime I'm moving, like we talked about the intention and the mindfulness, I try to add that in, especially with the breathing. I've been doing that with my training. I don't know if you've heard of Julian Pinal, but
Yeah.
with every exercise, there's a certain pattern of breathing, a certain cadence of breathing that I'll try to introduce. And that's a big internal fight while I'm doing that. So yeah, that embodiment practice has been huge. But yeah, that's about it. But I feel like I was asking you because I feel like people's spiritual or philosophical outlooks really affect their training systems, their training philosophies. Like I bet if you ask a classroom full of yogis, they might have similar answers. And if you ask a room full of CrossFitters or powerlifters, they might have a different answer as far as just their general outlook on life. And it's interesting to see how those relate to each other.
I
So
think that's yeah. Go ahead.
sorry, yeah. When I look into like Taoism or Zen or anything like that, when I'm training people, it's really big for me to try to not tell them what to do, but to almost remove what they think they have to do in their head. And I just see some parallels to what they're trying to do in Zen and what we're trying to do with people's movement as far as freeing it and breaking these just conceptions they have of what they're supposed to be doing or what they have to do. Or these, every training system, kettlebells, you name it, calisthenics, it's an ideology. Those are pretty much religions. And sounds like the movement culture is trying to be very, it's almost, I don't want to say atheistic, but you're trying to break free from those boundaries that we've been playing with. So, yeah, thank you for the answer.
Yeah, that's a fascinating topic. The subject of ideology and culture, because I think it probably depends on who you talk to in the movement world, whether or not they would say they're trying to break free of that. I think, first of all, it's an interesting question to think about. To what extent is the ideology itself fueling people's perspective in terms of practice, and to what extent is it just the culture that surrounds them? Because, like, for example, with yogis, I don't really know many yogis that actually read the Vedas or Vedanta, or I don't know many yogis who are really that equipped with with Hindu philosophy. They're just going to yoga classes and they're talking with yogis and they're making friends with yoga people and they're practicing in group classes and they're listening to their teachers. What are their teachers saying about what yoga is, and for the most part, I think the culture is fueled by the culture, and it's a very rare case to find somebody who is really driven ideologically by a system. Like maybe I would be one of those rare cases because on a spectrum of personality, I'm very I don't know how you would say it, focused on ideas maybe. If repeatedly on the Myers-Briggs the personality tests, I rank INTJ, which is highly intellectual, idea-focused personality. So I think, but my point is that it's rare. It's not so common to find that. So back to the movement culture thing. I think you're right to say that some people. There's this weird thing going on in the movement culture that's a lot of people are very they're using a lot of rhetoric in the same way that the sort of new atheist movement did. We don't want to be defined as this, we don't want to be defined as that, and using a lot of almost like sort of debate-like arguments to refute some of these systems. But I think there's a large part of the movement culture that wants to employ or immerse themselves at least partially in those cultures, and without subscribing to their dogmas uncritically, or I heard I don't know if you listened to John speak on the Mental Jiu-Jitsu podcast recently. But he was talking about how he jumped from martial arts discipline to martial arts discipline and from dance to dance discipline, And his intention was to throw away the stuff that wasn't directly applicable to him and that seemed extra, and keep the stuff that seemed to be potent and applicable to his practice and maybe broadly transferable. I'm not sure. He seemed to be looking for some cross-disciplinary principles that applied to him. So I think there's a large part of the movement community that's doing that. They're really interested in culture to the extent that it can inform their practice, but they're trying not to attach to the dogma of it, which is I think a valuable practice. I would say that I fall in that category.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the movement culture is starting to shift into that thing which it set out to be against in a way. Not everyone, but yeah, it's almost turning into a certain ideology, and then seems like there's a backlash from that coming out now. But yeah, you almost need, those structures are in place for a reason. I'm not saying we don't need them or they don't have value, but yeah, that's something I think about. Is it because it works for a lot of people, and a lot of people do find the principles and something bigger as far as a freedom in their movement from those rigid disciplines. I think that can lead to freedom, but I don't know if it's how the people take the journey or if it's the journey itself. I think it's just the mindset you have that really determines the benefit of the path you take,
It does very much, because every discipline that I dive into is like that. Some people take a lot away from it, and some people get lost. Some people get fixated on certain elements, and some people have a knack for sort of discerning the underlying principles. And some people fall away from the practice very quickly, or some people get addicted to it. It really depends on and so what I've observed over time is, like you say, it's really much it's very much about the person's psyche and approach rather than the discipline itself. Sometimes, like with Tai Chi, for example, when I studied Tai Chi here in Guangxi province, there were a lot of people who came to the practice, and you could tell, they're just very focused on certain elements of it and fixated on those without really understanding or having an idea about why they were there. They were like, oh, I saw a video and I really want my practice to look like this. I want my Tai Chi form to look like this in this person. And some people were there because they wanted to learn more about themselves, or some people were there because they wanted to lose weight, and that was their only reason for being there. And those motives might change over time, but for the most part, I notice what the plasticity of those motives is not as high as you'd think. What I mean to say, they don't change as much as some people might expect. Like the motives that people go in with are really hard to change. Like unless that's what you're doing, and that's your focus. Like that's what I do a lot in my teaching. When people show up to my class, I address a lot of the reasons why we're practicing, and I address a lot of the principles behind practice and what drives inquiry and stuff like this. But if you don't do that, I think it's very, very hard to cultivate a plasticity of motive for practice. Which I think that would go ahead first. Yeah, you go.
Oh no, go ahead and finish. Sorry.
No, I was gonna let that segue us into the topic about technique, but you go ahead first if you have thoughts.
Oh no, I was just thinking like the motive behind why people come in to start a practice. I always felt like, and this might just be subjectively what I feel it is for me, but I feel like it always goes back to something sexual. Like, people want to look better. They want to increase their sexual value, not even just physically, but I feel like if you're in a culture where doing a handstand is sexy, and that's going to increase your social like points, you're going to want to do a handstand. And if it's sexy not to be vain and not to do physique way, like people dig that. That's an in for them. So I feel like why people do it deep down, it's probably coming down to something in the ego. That's when I ask myself why, that's where I find my why coming from, if I ask enough questions. And I think that's normal. I don't think that's bad. And it can lead to positive practices. But yeah, so I always think about that. Like, deep down, if you keep chipping away, why are you doing this? You know, and I really think it comes down to something primal.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight, man, because yeah, I mean, if you ask any psychologist, they'll tell you the same thing. It's where a lot of our thoughts, motives, desires, drives, behavior is driven by survival and procreation. So it's no surprise that when we look at our movement practice and what appeals to us, that's not an exception. But I think what a mindfulness practice. Okay, I'll tell you why I don't like the word mindfulness, because I don't see my practice of mindfulness as since you asked.
I'm interested in this one.
I don't see my practice of mindfulness as a practice of filling my activities with my mind, or using my mind to be more aware of things. So, like a lot of people would use an action, like some kind of sport or movement, and say like, oh, I was completely present, or my mind was focused on what I was doing, and I was noticing the details of what I was doing, and that would be I was doing it mindfully, right? And so the word is equivocated in that way. So I'm doing it mindfully. Mindfully and mindfulness are often equivocated, and that's why I don't like the word, because when I practice mindfulness, it's more of an observation of my mind, of my mind's processes and thoughts. So I think a better way to describe it would just be mind practice, observing yeah.
You differentiate being mindful, watching the mind, and watching the body. Those are two separate things for you?
No, what I'm saying is that I'm not. I wouldn't say that the practice of mindfulness is using the mind as a tool. It's on an objective plane of reality, that may actually be what's happening. Like, I can't say for sure because I'm not a neuroscientist, but I can say that the way I conceptualize the practice and the way I practice it is not filling my activities with whether it's thinking or whether it's some kind of mental process or whether it's physical process. You know, not to say that there's a distinction between the two, but I'm saying that I don't fill those activities with my mind and use my mind to become more aware of them. Like I do those things, but I don't call that a mindfulness practice. I don't call that my mind practice. That might be a mindfulness practice. But what I'm trying to depict here in terms of my practice is that it's not a practice of using my mind. It's a practice of observing it, stepping outside of it, and watching its processes. And when I watch the body, for example, I think that is a mindfulness practice because I'm using my mind, and I'm using the tools there in terms of my thoughts and my faculties of logic and reason and observation to take note of what's happening. So in that sense, I would make a distinction between physical observation and mental observation, because how do you observe? How do you observe the mind with more mind? It doesn't really make sense. So maybe that was a little bit convoluted, but
oh, dude, I would love for you to write a blog about that so I could read it. That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know if you were talking about a mindfulness versus an awareness practice.
that might be one good way to distinguish.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it comes down to basically a hard philosophical question of what is doing the observing. That's the hard question. Because if you say it's an awareness practice, okay, the question is not aware of what. The question is what is being aware. Who is doing the observing, and from what point am I making the observation? And so I'm saying that it's very difficult to observe, to describe the mindfulness practice as using the mind to observe the mind, because anybody in the contemplative tradition who's really gone deep into it wouldn't say it that way. They wouldn't say that I'm using more thought to observe my thoughts. That might be one element of it. They might use thoughts later on to analyze the patterns of their own thoughts, or to figure out how those thoughts and those patterns of thoughts are impacting their day-to-day life. That might be one, like thoughts and reason and analysis might be one way that they do that. But the process of sitting there or walking around or wherever you're doing the practice, and observing the mind's fluctuations and patterns in that moment, I think most would agree who are deep in that practice that it's not a practice of mindfulness. Like, you're not filling the practice with mind, you're watching the mind from a different space.
So you're looking at the actual word, like mind, what it means when you're saying that, not the practice.
Yeah,
we want, right? You just think it's a bad name for that practice.
Yeah, it's a question of terminology. So maybe I'm just being a dick.
Yeah,
being insistent on the word.
I agree with you, because there is no observer behind the mind, right? So when you're being mindful,
Felipe Yoga here just left a comment. He said it I think he meant consciousness observing the mind. That's the way that most contemplatives would put it. Thanks, Felipe. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so you're saying you're not expanding or filling the mind while you're doing that, which that makes total sense. What would be a better word?
Yeah,
practice.
I think just keep it simple. Mind practice leaves it open. Like, just because that can mean I'm practicing observing the mind. It can be just a simple like observation practice, or it could be it's hard because words fall short in a lot of ways. Because if you say meditation, that comes with a lot of baggage, and people associate that with sitting down in a robe or something in a temple. But so I think what I like is mind practice.
I got a question for you. I hear a lot of people in the movement culture explain their love for like hand balancing as the meditation. And for what I've experienced, that is the last thing from a meditation. I'm just trying not to fall, and I'm just trying to breathe. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. But first of all, why do you think that they're different?
I think it comes with the culture. Because if you ask someone, why are you hand balancing? What comes to my mind is, it looks cool. I want to do something that looks cool. And that answer, I feel like in that culture, is they're trying to get away from that. So it's almost like they try to make a mystical, deep answer where I don't really know if there's ground or substance for that. But I'm not really, someone like you would know, because you're good at that stuff and you're an expert. So I wanted to see what you would say.
That's the last thing I would call myself, but an expert. But I will say that you have some insight there, and primarily your insight being that a lot of people are full of shit. You know, they say one thing, I'm doing this, you know, for A and B, but actually they're really not, and they're just trying to cover it up to make it seem like what they're doing is more meaningful or deeper. So I think that's a valuable insight. Some people are doing that, but I wrote about this in one of my Instagram posts a while back. The distinction between like flow state and meditation, and I use climbing as an example because, as you may or may not know, here where I am in Yangshuo is one of the climbing hubs of the world. So a lot of people come here for the limestone crags, and it's a really popular sport here. Sport climbing on real walls outside. So I got really into that here because my girlfriend, who I met here, is an avid climber, and she showed me the ropes, so to speak, and so I started to get really into that, and so I like to use that as a metaphor for the practice of flow state. And a lot of people will say, like you said, like handstands. You know, handstands, climbing. You can substitute either one of those. They're both physical practice that they demand a lot of focus, mental focus, intensity. And like, I don't know if you played a field sport, but field sports are the same way. There are moments in field sports, like when I used to play soccer, is you forget you're on the field, you forget that it's a game, you forget that everything else, but you are the game. That's it. And it's like that with climbing or with handstanding. Is you are the handstand, and you are just climbing, and it's not almost like you lose a sense of self, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm starting to sound a little bit like that metaphysical bullshit you were talking about earlier, but that's what we're getting at, is that it's you lose a sense of self, and you reach this altered state of consciousness. So I think I have a note here about this. I don't want to get their names wrong. Yeah, so I read a book recently by Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson. They talk about, they make this useful distinction between altered states and altered traits. So I would describe flow state in like climbing or handstanding or field sports, where you lose your sense of self and you're just completely engrossed in what's going on, and you're 100% focused and present. Based on the demands, the high physical demand of the sport or whatever you're doing, as a flow state or an altered state. Basically, you're creating an altered state of consciousness based on the external demands of the environment. Mm-hmm. So that and one thing to note about that is that it's a transient state. So it's evanescent. It comes and goes quickly based on the external environment, and you can recreate it maybe more or less with the environment, but it's an altered state, and it's transient, it's evanescent, it comes and goes. Meditation is in many ways the opposite of that, because we're not putting ourselves in a situation where we have little room for mental fluctuation. We're putting ourselves in a situation on purpose that has the most possible room for mental fluctuation, and then practicing. So it's like, okay, I'm going to sit down now, and I'm going to give my mind the most possible room and space to run around in a circle. And now I'm just going to watch what happens. And that is a much different practice than being on, I can tell you from experience, that's a much different practice than being on a rock wall and shitting your pants. And you're there and you're present because you just have to be. Right?
You have.
So.
Dude, I love that you're saying that, because this is exactly, we talk about the steps. It goes from, I don't know if I'm going to keep using this, but mindfulness on one end, which is you're watching your body and your joints. So you've heard of cars, like an FRC.
Yeah.
We'll just explore without trying to change anything. You're just observing what you can do.
So for those of you who don't know, by the way, I think maybe some people from my following don't know, cars is an acronym for controlled articular rotations. So just moving your joint through a clearly articulated range of motion in a sort of a circular pattern. I don't know if that is a good definition, but just...
Yeah, we're just looking at the full articulation of a given joint.
Yeah.
And we're looking at it, we're exploring it, we're taking stock of it. And that's really hard for people. It's not fun. It takes a lot of, it's the boring, unsexy stuff. And I feel like the mindfulness part is. And then, like I said, the end goal is to be able to play and just let your body go and explore and lose yourself and go into that flow state. And there's a distinction between the two. They are almost opposites. When you lose yourself and you're in that, I feel like that's the meaningful, that's the goal, you know? I feel like there's meaning in that, but there's freedom that comes from the mindfulness practice that you gain to be able to cross over into the play and the meaning, and, you know, where there's no rules and where you're not confined. On the other end, you're isolating and you're just cooking, you know, you're just watching.
Sure.
And that's where magic happens on both ends, and I think they're connected in a way. So yeah,
absolutely.
Dude, resonating with that.
Yeah, I think you're right to say they're absolutely connected. Like, who is this here? Shital? I'm not sure how to say your name. Sorry if I fucked it up. Sense of self is created by mind. An immense engagement of body gets you out of head and puts you in a relaxed state. So yeah, I think like what you're saying is not wrong. These are Shital. Sorry for the name again. You're the Shital. There's a connection there for sure, and I'm not saying that these practices are mutually exclusive. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that the practices themselves and the shape they take are distinct, and the circumstances under which we practice are different. So, yeah.
Can I contradict myself though? So I don't know.
Definitely not. This conversation is over.
So there's a book, Rise of the Superhuman, all about the flow state in athletics, and I guess the research I've seen in there, they hook up people in this flow state like surfing, rock climbing, you know, this where you're in the present moment, whether you like it or not. And they've also hooked up people on psychedelic drugs, and
sure.
These advanced meditators, and they all are having the same parts of their brain shut down and turn on. So they're in the same kind of neural state when this is happening. So I'm wondering, is you know, objectively in the material world, what's going on, is it a different state, or is it just a different practice that leads you to somewhere similar?
Yeah, that's a super good question, and I think that'll lead me back to complete my thoughts about the altered traits versus altered states thing. So in meditation, there's also altered states, right? Like there are people who go into deep meditation and they experience like a very similar experience to what a handstander or a rock climber or somebody who's a high level athlete would experience, or who's highly engrossed in a physical activity. They're present. They lose a sense of self. They might even experience hallucinations or an altered state of consciousness, like you would on LSD or something like this. And that's a real experience. And like you said, that and there are also experiments out there. Let me slow down. I'm excited. There are also experiments out there that have shown through neural imaging that these experiences are roughly the same in terms of the activity in the brain. And so that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that altered states and altered traits can occur in either in any practice. But altered traits are a particular facet of meditation practice that can occur when you develop a regular practice of observing the mind and its patterns, and then that carries over, that consistent and habitual and regular practice carries over into day-to-day life, and it becomes, it changes the way your brain functions in a casual circumstance from day to day. And that would be an altered trait, because we're talking about behavioral traits now. and traits of the mind. You can even alter the mind structure through this kind of thing. So yeah, you can have an altered state in meditation practice or mindfulness practice, even just a casual circumstance, and you can experience this altered state. And that would be similar or comparable to something that you might experience in a different context. But an altered trait is different. And that's why I think, yeah, meditation is distinct in that way. What, they cut us off, so we might have to go again. It says at 1 minute and 50 seconds remaining.
Yeah, you would have to like save it and redo it if you want to continue. But dude,
Holy mackerel. Yeah.
It just hit me what you were saying, dude. I'm really slow, and I just got it. I feel like I'm in an altered state right now. Listening to you, dude. That's good stuff.
Sometimes the jargon can be confusing, and
no,
you need to get specific about language.
I'm just a meathead, so it takes longer to get this kind of stuff for me.
Man, I can't believe this passed so quickly. We hardly got to anything
We
that I
could do
wanted to get to.
that if you want.
If you have time, yeah, we can.
Yeah, I got time.
Okay. All right. So I guess, guys, so I don't know how this works, but I guess we'll be logging off and then logging back on immediately because Instagram wants us to. So
they're trying to shut it down, man. It's getting too real.
Yeah, fuck the system. So we're gonna go at it again in a minute. So hope to see you guys again. If you're enjoying this, log on again and talk to me and DJ for a bit.
All right. Hell yeah.